The restaurant glowed with warm light and clinking glasses, laughter floating in the air as people gathered in small groups around tables, chatting about ordinary things. No one noticed the older man who sat quietly near the window. His clothes neat, but simple. His eyes hidden behind thin wire glasses, his hands folded carefully over a small notebook that seemed too elegant for the scene around him, a detail that went unseen by most, yet carried the weight of something waiting to unfold. He did not speak. He only watched the people, the families, the couples, the waiters moving between tables with quick efficiency, the smell of roasted garlic and butter filling the air. One of the servers, a young woman with a tired but kind expression, paused. For a moment to catch her breath near the counter, her name tag read Aya. She looked up and saw him sitting alone, the untouched glass of water before him, sparkling faintly under the light. Something in his stillness made her hesitate for just a second. No one else seemed to see him. A group of businessmen at the bar laughed loudly, their conversation spilling over about deals and deadlines. A family with restless children occupied the far corner, but the quiet man remained unseen, almost invisible. He looked down at his notebook, flipping a single page, slowly, with precise care. The handwriting inside, barely visible yet elegant strokes of Japanese kanji. Aya noticed the characters for only a moment before turning away, though the image burned quietly in her mind. She carried an empty tray past his table, noticing how no one else approached him. None of the other servers bothered to check his table. They assumed he had already been helped, or that he would leave soon. He sat in calm patience, as if waiting for something or someone. Aya hesitated, her curiosity growing stronger with every glance. The man's posture was not ordinary, not timid, but composed, like someone who had learned to wait through storms. She approached him quietly, her steps soft over the polished floor. When she reached his table, he looked up slowly, and their eyes met for the first time. There was something deep in his gaze, an old calm that made her heartbeat quicken. She opened her mouth to greet him in English, but something inside her hesitated. She saw the small notebook again, the precise kanji, the faint whisper of a homeland she had not spoken of in years, and the words came out in Japanese. For a moment, the entire room seemed to pause. The air stilled, the faint hum of conversation dimming around them as the man's eyes widened slightly. The corners of his mouth softening in surprise, he replied in slow, measured Japanese, his voice low but rich, the tone of someone who had spent years commanding, silence not demanding it. Aya blinked, taken aback by the warmth that slipped beneath his composure, something quiet and powerful that lingered like memory. Their conversation unfolded softly under the clatter of dishes. She asked if he wanted anything to eat. He said he was fine for now. His accent, old Tokyo, polished precise. He asked how long she had been working there. She told him 3 years since moving from Osaka. He nodded slowly, as if measuring each word she spoke, every detail, sinking deep. Into the quiet between them, she did not realize the other customers were beginning to glance their way, drawn by something they could not name. The manager passed by frowning when he noticed Aya standing too long at one table. He gestured for her to move along, but the old man raised his hand slightly, and the gesture was enough to make the manager pause. Something in the authority of that simple motion stopped him. Mid-step, the man's calm eyes met his for a brief instant, and the manager turned away without a word. Aya noticed this subtle shift, her pulse quickening, though she did not understand why his presence seemed to carry weight beyond appearance. He asked her name in Japanese, repeating it softly, as if testing the syllables. She smiled shyly, unsure why she felt nervous. His voice carried a faint familiarity that reminded her of her late grandfather, who had spoken with the same quiet dignity. She asked him his name, and he paused for a moment as if considering what to reveal. Then said Sato, simply, Sato. Aya nodded politely, though something in her heart whispered that the name carried a greater story. As the minutes passed, Aya noticed small details she had missed before the man's watch, though modest, gleamed with craftsmanship, the kind not sold in ordinary stores. The pen he used to write in his notebook bore a custom engraving. His shoes, handmade, perfectly kept, though old, his posture that of someone accustomed to both respect and solitude. She wondered, what kind of man sat quietly like this, invisible in plain sight, surrounded by people too busy to see what was before them? When another waiter brought a bill to a nearby table, Aya caught a glimpse of a man at the bar, whispering and pointing subtly. Toward Sato, one of the businessmen muttered something in disbelief, pulling out his phone, showing a picture on the screen. Aya caught only part of it, a face nearly identical to the one at the window, surrounded by flashing cameras and bold letters. In Japanese, she looked again at Sato and felt the air change. Though she said nothing, the suspense clawed quietly at the edge of her mind. Sato noticed her glance. His eyes softening slightly, he smiled and said in Japanese, "You have good observation. Not everyone does." She blinked, unsure how to respond. He closed his notebook gently, placing it beside the glass of untouched water. The pen neatly aligned upon it. He looked out the window at the city lights, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight beneath the surface. Do you ever wonder what happens when people forget to see beyond what they expect? Aya hesitated, her throat dry, before nodding slowly. He nodded in return. His eyes drifting back to the notebook, she wanted to ask who he was, but the words stuck in her throat before she could speak. A sound came from the front of the restaurant, a sharp commotion as a sleek black car pulled to a stop outside. Two men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the entrance. Their expressions focused, deliberate. The customers barely noticed, too lost in their dinners, but Aya's eyes locked onto them. Something about their posture, too precise, too professional. Sato's eyes flicked toward the reflection in the window for only a moment before returning to Aya, his voice calm. "Tell me, Aya," he said, "what do you believe is more dangerous, being seen or being unseen?" She stared at him, unable to form an answer, as one of the suited men entered the restaurant, scanning the room, their eyes sweeping across the tables before settling on the window corner. Sato smiled faintly, finishing his glass of water in one slow motion. His hand steady, Aya took a step back, uncertain of what was unfolding. The suited men approached quietly, their expressions unreadable. The manager looked confused, stepping forward as if to intervene. But one of the men flashed a badge quickly, the kind that stopped questions before they could form. Aya felt the room grow still again, her pulse loud in her ears. Sato stood slowly, bowing lightly toward her, the faintest trace of sadness in his smile, as if something long delayed had finally arrived. He spoke softly in Japanese again. "Thank you, Aya, for reminding me of my home." She stared at him, not understanding his meaning as he turned toward the approaching men who now stood respectfully at a distance. The taller one bowed low, speaking in rapid Japanese, his tone deferential. Reverend Aya caught only fragments, but she heard enough: the words, "Chairman, return, please. Security has been waiting." The room seemed to tilt, the noise fading into an echo of disbelief. The other customers finally turned toward the commotion, whispers spreading quickly. The old man, the quiet man, the one no one noticed, was now standing tall, his simple clothes unable to hide the authority that radiated from him. Aya felt her knees weaken as realization dawned. Sato, the man sitting alone at table 12, was not just wealthy, but one of the most influential figures in Japan, his face now unmistakable. From the photographs, the entire restaurant frozen in quiet awe. He looked at Aya one last time, his expression soft and unreadable, his voice calm and low when he said, "Remember, kindness is noticed even when the world is not watching." And then he turned, Walking slowly between the tables, the two suited men following behind the door opened the night air spilling in with the sound of rain beginning to fall, the headlights washing the doorway in white as the figures disappeared into the waiting car that vanished almost silently into the city beyond. Aya stood still at his empty table, the untouched glass, the notebook gone. The faint circle of condensation left behind a mark, already fading beneath the restaurant light. She felt the eyes of everyone on her, yet heard nothing, only the soft hum of her own pulse echoing in the silence around her. She reached for the rag to clear the table and froze for a moment, realizing something small glinted faintly near the edge of the plate. Something that should not have been left behind. It was a folded piece of paper, thick, textured, delicate. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 3 lines written in perfect kanji, the ink still drying, the words simple but powerful. And though she could not fully grasp their meaning, she knew they were not for the world but for her alone. And in that moment she realized the quiet man had not just been seen, but had chosen her to witness something beyond measure. And her heart pounded as she read the final line and looked toward the door. The night outside glowed faintly with city lights, the rain streaking the window like faint brush strokes of memory. Aya whispered his name softly, her reflection merging with the blurred glass as if the moment itself was folding into memory. The silence returned to the restaurant life, resuming around her, but she knew something had changed, a story left behind in ink and reflection, a secret known only to her and S. The office felt colder now, the shadows stretching across the walls as if the past itself had entered with Marie and the Admiral. He still held the medal in his hand, turning it over and over as though the medal alone could tell him what words never would, and Marie stood silently, her hands clasped in front of her body. Eyes distant but unblinking, she began to speak slowly. At first her voice a whisper that seemed to echo off the polished surfaces of the room. The story of that night, when the Sia had become a wall of fire and smoke, and how she had been thrown into a chaos where survival was a choice not given to anyone freely. She described the mission with precision, though each word carried weight, not of technical detail, but of memory, of fear of loss, and of the faint hope that had flickered when she had pulled men from water that could have claimed them without warning. Each name she spoke sounded like a drumbeat of ghosts. The Admiral listened, his posture stiff yet attentive, trying to reconcile the orderly reports he had received with the living proof standing before him. The files, the paperwork, the official history, none of it captured the truth. The truth was in her eyes, in the way she paused between sentences as if some words might shatter the air. She told him about the explosion that had split the ship, and how she had thought she was alone, how the world had narrowed to the sound of her own breathing, and the distant cries of men she could not reach. She had dragged the wounded through corridors that were flooding with water that smelled of salt and oil, her hands slick, her uniform torn, but every step deliberate. She had chosen to save them all or die trying, and in that moment the Admiral realized. The reports that had listed her as missing had been written to hide shame, not heroism, and that the medals and commendations she should have received had been stolen by bureaucracy and silence. He asked her why she had returned to a life that seemed so ordinary when she had done extraordinary things. She paused, tilting her head slightly, as if measuring how much to reveal some part of her smile, almost imperceptible, and said that extraordinary deeds were never theirs to keep, that what mattered was survival, that what mattered was remembering those who did not come back. She did not need accolades or recognition. She had her memories and the sound of the ocean still in her ears, and that was enough for her, but he could see it was not enough for him. The Admiral felt a strange sense of urgency rising in his chest. He had commanded men through battle, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of a story that could undo reputations and shake the foundations of what he had believed about honor and loss, He leaned forward, pressing his hands against the desk, and asked her about the men who had disappeared, the ones officially listed as casualties. She looked down her fingers, brushing the edge of her medal, and said, "Some went under the waves and never returned. Some walked away from the chaos and were never traced. The rest depended on luck and timing." And he realized with a chill that the files he had trusted contained lies meticulously crafted to hide failure. Marie led him to the small window and pointed beyond the academy grounds to the river winding through the city, the water dark and restless under the morning light. She said that night the river had looked like this, except the moon had burned pale over smoke and fire, and the men she had saved had been pulled from currents that wanted to claim them. She told him that even now she could feel the pull of that water as if it remembered her touch, as if it were waiting for someone to reveal the rest of the story, and the Admiral stared at her, unable to turn away, because he knew instinctively that the moment he stepped beyond that threshold, he would see things no report could ever describe. He asked her why she had returned to cleaning floors, why she had chosen anonymity over recognition. She met his gaze and said that the world often rewards the wrong people and punishes the right ones. That the higher you climb, the more you see corruption hidden behind medals and ribbons, that the truth of courage is not in the accolades, but in the choices you make when no one is watching, and that sometimes the bravest act is to vanish into ordinary life and carry your own truth quietly until it finds someone who is willing to see it. The Admiral felt a knot in his stomach because he realized that this woman standing before him had witnessed horrors he had only read about in reports, and yet she had returned not for vengeance, not for fame, but for closure, and perhaps to remind him that history was not written by the victors alone, and that some truths would remain hidden if not for courage, the kind that was silent and deliberate, and she was the embodiment of that courage, and he had underestimated it for decades, and he wondered how many other stories were buried like hers. He opened another file on his desk, the one with the orders and the maps and the mission objectives. He traced his fingers over the lines connecting points of land and water, and then paused at a note. He had never noticed before a reference to an unreported extraction. He looked at Marie and asked if she had been involved. She nodded slowly and said that she had carried them out under cover of smoke and confusion, that she had navigated enemy waters that no one was supposed to enter, and that she had brought the men back one by one, sometimes under fire, sometimes when silence was the only shield. And the Admiral realized that the medal he held was not the measure of her deeds, but only the smallest fragment of a story no one had believed until now. Marie said that the danger was not only in the mission, but in those who wished it had never happened, that some people in positions of power had erased records and eliminated witnesses, that there were still secrets in the Navy that some would kill to protect, and the Admiral felt a cold shiver run down his spine because he knew that the recognition of truth could be as dangerous as the acts themselves, and that standing in this office, he was no longer just an observer, but a participant in a history that refused to remain hidden. He asked her if she feared for her life. Now she smiled faintly and said, fear was always a companion. That night had taught her that. But she was careful and observant and silent when it mattered, and she had learned to vanish into ordinary life when necessary. And still she carried the map of that night in her memory, and anyone who sought to uncover it would have to reckon with her first. And he realized that the danger was closer than he had imagined, because he could feel the ripple of it even here, in the calm of the Academy office. Marie stepped closer and handed him a worn envelope, a map inside marked with coordinates and names that had never been declassified. He said this should not exist, and she said that the truth often does not exist in documents. It exists in memory, in action, in the witness of someone who survived, and she had survived, and he understood that the next steps would change everything, and that he would have to choose whether to protect the secret or expose it, knowing that doing so could rewrite history and put lives in jeopardy. And then the phone rang in the office, a sharp, harsh sound that sliced the silence. Marie froze, and the Admiral reached for it, but before he could answer, she whispered that someone was already looking for them, that the past had caught up faster than they imagined, and he realized that the calm of the morning was gone, replaced by a tension that pulsed in the air, and that the story was no longer contained in files or medals, but alive in the footsteps echoing outside the office door. He glanced at Marie, her eyes steady but alert. She nodded toward the window and said they needed to move because the people who wanted the truth buried would come for it before the day ended, and he understood that the story they had begun to uncover would not remain hidden for long, and that whatever choice they made next could change not only their lives, but the lives of those who had been lost to silence years ago. And as they prepared to leave the office together, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, and the first shadow appeared at the end of the hallway. The hallway stretched ahead like a tunnel of shadow and light, the sound of their footsteps muted by the polished floor, but the tension thick between them was almost tangible. Marie led the Admiral quickly, her eyes scanning each corner, each doorway, as if the walls themselves might betray them. She moved with the grace of someone who had learned to vanish into places no one expected to look, and he followed, struggling to keep pace, his uniform stiff against his skin, but his mind sharp as ever, aware that the first shadow they had seen was only the beginning. They reached the stairwell, and Marie glanced up the flights, her hand brushing the rail cold, and worn her breath steady, though she felt the familiar sting of nerves, the kind that had kept her alive in fire and water. She whispered that they were not alone, that someone had been tracking their movements since she had returned to the academy, and the Admiral froze for a moment, the weight of command settling on his shoulders. Because this was no longer about medals or memory, this was about survival, and the first rule of survival was knowing when you were being hunted. The door at the top of the stairwell opened with a soft creak, and they slipped inside the empty room. Lights low and shadows pooling across the corners, and Marie moved to the window, peering out at the street below. The Admiral leaned against the wall, his hand still clutching the envelope with the coordinates the map inside marked places no one was supposed to know about. He felt a chill, because the past was moving faster than anyone had predicted, and that the secret they carried could spark consequences beyond their imagining, and outside the faint hum of traffic masked the quiet danger, closing in around them. She turned to him, eyes dark in the low light, and said they had to leave the building now, that waiting was the most dangerous thing they could do. He nodded quickly, unsure where to go, but trusting her instinct, she led him toward the side exit where the shadows gathered like a cloak and the night air hit them cold and sharp as they stepped onto the street, the city alive with lights and movement but unaware of the storm about to hit it. The Admiral's mind raced, connecting dots he had never been able to reconcile with reports and paperwork. The truth was raw and alive, and it had a pulse that matched the one racing in his chest. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, faint at first, then louder like a drumbeat of warning, and Marie did not glance back. She led them through alleys and side streets, twisting and turning, her knowledge of hidden paths precise, as if she had mapped them in her memory. During another life, the Admiral struggled to keep up, but he had seen combat. He had navigated chaos, and now he realized that her ordinary appearance had been a shield, a way to move unnoticed, even when the past tried to reach out and claim her. She whispered that the people after them had resources, and they would not hesitate to act, and he understood that this was more than curiosity. This was danger wrapped in bureaucracy and secrecy. They reached a narrow bridge spanning a canal, and Marie paused, her eyes scanning the darkness below the water. Reflecting faint city lights, she whispered that this place had saved lives once before and might do so again. He asked how she knew, and she gave a faint smile, almost regretful, saying that memory sometimes carries maps that paper cannot hold. Followed her across the bridge, silently noticing every detail, Every potential hazard, every shadow, and the sound of approaching footsteps made his pulse tighten because the hunters were closer than they thought, and the city around them seemed, suddenly, unfamiliar. She stopped suddenly at the edge of the bridge and pointed toward a boat tied loosely to the railing. He realized it was prepared to move fast if necessary. She instructed him to follow quietly, and they climbed aboard the small vessel, the water cold against their hands, the ropes creaking as they released them, the city lights blurring as the current pulled them into darkness. She maneuvered with skill that belied her janitor appearance, and he felt the adrenaline he had, not experienced in years as the boat cut through the canal silent, but fast, and every wave carried a threat, as if the river remembered the night of the mission she had survived. The Admiral finally spoke, asking who could want the truth hidden after. All these years, Marie glanced at him, her eyes steady but wary. She said that some people in power had relied on the narrative of failure and loss to cover mistakes that could have destroyed careers, that the medals and the files were weapons in a war of memory and influence, and that those same people still had operatives ready to erase anyone who threatened to expose the truth. He swallowed hard, because he understood that the simple act of survival had now become a political risk, and that even he was vulnerable in this web of secrecy. A noise suddenly came from the canal behind them, the splash of a motor engine cutting through the water, and Marie ducked low, keeping the boat silent. The Admiral followed instinctively, and they drifted into a narrow channel almost invisible to the pursuing craft. The tension built so tightly in the air that each breath felt like a betrayal, and the river seemed to pulse beneath them, as if alive with memory and intent. And he realized with a cold clarity that they were being hunted not for themselves, but for what they knew. She told him the coordinates were not random, that they led to a hidden cache of files and recordings that proved everything she had said that the mission had never been a failure, that the lost men had been rescued in secret, and that some of the medals and commendations had been deliberately withheld to protect powerful figures. She paused, letting the weight of that sink in, and he realized that the envelope he carried could destroy reputations or validate the courage of the forgotten, and that every step forward increased the danger for both of them. The motorboat behind them grew louder, cutting closer, and Marie started the engine smoothly. Keeping them low in the water, the Admiral gripped the side, the rush of wind whipping his face, and for a moment the cityscape seemed surreal. Calm against the threat pursuing them, she whispered that they would have to split up if necessary, and he felt the instinct to argue, but the truth in her eyes told him that there was no room for hesitation, and that every decision could be life or death, and the shadows behind them were already forming patterns he could not yet predict. They reached a small dock hidden by reeds and overgrowth. She guided the Admiral into the shadows, warning him to keep low as she disappeared briefly to check the perimeter, and he felt the tension tighten because the river did not forgive mistakes, and the night was alive with danger and memory, and he realized that trust was the only weapon he had, and that she had more than that. She had the knowledge of survival etched into her muscles and reflexes. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness on the dock, someone moving silently with lethal precision. The Admiral raised his hands instinctively, ready to confront. But Marie appeared from the reeds beside him, her stance calm, confident, and the figure froze. Recognizing the determination in her eyes, she spoke softly a single command, and the figure hesitated, then retreated silently into the shadows, and he realized that her authority was invisible but undeniable, and that every action she had taken to survive the past now extended into the present, protecting them both. Marie handed him a second envelope with further coordinates instructions for accessing the files that would validate her story, and he felt the weight of history in his hands, realizing that the mission he had only known in fragments was now whole and alive, and that every lie he had believed was shattered by a woman who had survived against impossible odds, and he understood that the next step would reveal everything to the world, or seal it forever. and that time was slipping away as the night pressed closer. She looked at him and said that the final hurdle would be the hardest, that there were still people who would kill to preserve the lie, and he nodded, knowing that the adrenaline and courage of the past. Few hours would not be enough, but that he trusted her skill and judgment absolutely, and the canal whispered beneath them, carrying them toward a warehouse where secrets slept for decades, and the lights of the pursuing craft flickered like hungry eyes behind them as they approached the dock near the warehouse. Marie slowed the boat and gestured toward a concealed entrance. He followed silently, the air thick with tension, the adrenaline in his veins sharp as knives, and he realized that the final confrontation was imminent, that the truth would either be secured or lost forever, and that the shadows waiting inside could move faster than their courage, and that nothing about this moment would ever be forgotten. The Admiral felt a strange calm mixed with terror, because he knew that every step forward would demand trust in Marie and in the courage of those who had survived the mission, and that the medal he had once held lightly now represented a story of bravery, deceit, and survival, far beyond his imagination, and that history would not be rewritten lightly. And as they disappeared into the warehouse shadows, the sound of the city behind them seemed distant and small, and the first signs of those who had been tracking them appeared at the edge of the property, and he realized that the night was far from over, and that every secret that had been buried was awake and hungry and ready to fight for survival. And he understood that nothing would ever be the same again.